Bye.
Basically, all the video
Ready to go, okay. So before we get started, just want to mention that a few of the online viewers inquired about my health because they noticed that I cough occasionally.
Oh, wow.
And first of all, thank you very much. I appreciate the concern. There's actually two issues there. One, I actually had about half of my life respiratory problems. And I came to learn that many of them were self-inflicted. For me, it was more about dehydration. And so I read a book on the importance of drinking water, and gosh, I eliminated sinus infections, bronchitis, the occasional asthma in the wintertime, and seasonal allergies. It's been like 20 years since I had any of that stuff. So I'm still a little prone to the dryness in the winter. And I'll take that over those diseases anytime.
Yeah, good.
Hi, Randy. In addition to that, I'm also an introvert. Typical computer nerd. I spend all my day doing IT work, and most of my conversations with people are electronic. So the amount of speaking that I do when I teach a class is probably more speaking than I do in any 2 or 3 day period. It's a lot for my little throat to handle. So thank you for the concern, but no need to be worried. I don't have COVID, and I'm not ill, at least not physically. So let's pray and we'll get started. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity to study your word and the privilege of studying the Torah. And we ask that you guide us in our understanding. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. One thing I want to mention, even during this introduction here, is terms. At the very end of the introduction, you're seeing parenthesis, the word mishpatim. That's the key word in chapters 20 and 21, 21, and 22. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 11. We got a list of terms there. Very often when I hear people speak on this, they usually just kind of write these off and say, oh yeah, those are just a bunch of commandments. That's all that it means. But here it says, this is in chapter 11, Deuteronomy verse 1. Love the Lord your God and keep his requirements, decrees, his laws, his commands always. And those terms actually mean something different. The first one is a term that's called mishmeret, which has to do with responsibilities. And really, you see that mostly in Numbers chapter 3 and 4, and it's talking about the responsibilities given to the various the three Levite clans and how they are to take care of the tabernacle. The second one is decree. Sometimes it's statutes or ordinances, and that's the word chok. And those are things that are, it's like they're practices, things that are in addition to commandments. And there's a lot about that. And the one that says laws, is your third word say laws, or do you have something different?
I got laws.
Okay. That's in my opinion, that's a mistranslation. And that's our word mishpatim, or mishpat. Mishpatim is the plural. It comes from a word that means to judge. Shafat is the word to judge, and mishpatim is a judgment or a ruling. It has to do with the consequences for breaking the commandments. It's like the judicial ruling, the punishment. And that's what we're going to study tonight. And then the last one are commands. And I don't know how consistent it is. I haven't done a thorough study on it. But I think that's primarily the thou shall nots, things that you should not do. Whereas like those decrees and ordinances have to do with things that you should do very often, in addition to the things you should not do. So let's get back over to chapter 21, and we'll start right off with that word there. So right there in chapter 21, the first verse, these are the, again, there's, in my opinion, the mistranslation, the laws you are to set before them. The word is mishpatim. It should be rulings, because as you look through this section, we're going to see the consequences for breaking certain laws. And this, there's a format that's followed in the Hebrew that goes from chapter 21, verse 1, all the way to chapter 22, verse 17. And then the grammar and the format changes. So that's why that's how I section this off, because the format is the same all the way from 21 through 22, verse 17. This is important because even though God turned over judgment to the earthly judges, the human judges in Israel, I think he's giving these rulings here to set a precedence, to give them something to work from. And therefore they would never deviate from the things that he's mentioned here. There's no way he could mention everything. I mean, there's nothing in here about software piracy, or internet law or identity theft, but he had to start somewhere. And so in this section here, he's starting with personal injury. And in the next chapter, we'll get into property damage and theft, and the rulings or the judgments pertaining to those things. So when it comes to rulings, there's a term that's often used in the courtroom today. So I thought I'd throw some Latin at you. That's what that first word is there from Wikipedia, lex talionis. Says this is the principle. The principle is sometimes referred to using the Latin term lex talionis or the law of talion, which really means legal retaliation. The English word talion comes from the Latin talio, and means a retaliation authorized by law, in which the punishment corresponds in kind and degree to the injury. And that's important. The punishment must fit the crime. So I'm going to skip to the middle of the chapter, because that's the heart and soul of this chapter. And then in the next chapter, too, we'll do a little bit of comparison there. But let's turn over to, you're in chapter 21 already. Go over to verse 23. In my opinion, this is the key verse of the chapter, and everything else before it and after has to do with special considerations, maybe some exceptions. And this is a verse you often hear misquoted. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. Now, you normally hear people quote this verse, usually for nefarious reasons. They're trying to make you think badly of the Bible. It's all about vigilantism, taking the law into your own hands, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What was it in Fiddler on the Roof? Was Raptevia who said, oh yes, if we do that, the whole world will be blind and toothless? But really, this is pretty much stating, the intended understanding is the very thing that we read in this definition here. The punishment fits the crime. It doesn't say teeth for tooth, or feet for foot. It's a one-for-one correspondence, and that's the principle that we find here, that there is when it comes to personal injury, there's a one-for-one correspondence between the punishment and the crime. By way of comparison, let's look over to the next chapter when it comes to property damage and theft. Let's go down chapter 22, verse 9. It says, in all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, garment, or any other lost property about which someone says, this is mine, both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judge declares guilty must pay back double. So when it comes to this subject, subject of principle is a 2-for-1, whereas with personal injury, it's a 1-for-1. And around there also, before and after, there's exceptions, special cases, special considerations. So those verses have to be the key verse, and everything else is understood in that context. So let's take a minor deviation here. Okay, we're going to get into chapter 21. Everything I just explained about rulings and about how this chapter is about personal injury, and all of a sudden we jump into the subject of slavery. There's no segue there at all. Now, as you'll see in the outline here, I have the first item regarding indentured servitude in gray. That's because I'm not going to cover it. We don't have time for it. If it turns out that way, we may cover it. I just want to show you that I had prepared for it if we had time. But in general, I do want to say this. I think there's a reason why this is listed here. And that is because first of all, indentured servitude really is employment. You may not realize this, but prior to the Revolutionary War, I believe 80% or more of the Europeans who came to this country came here as slaves. Technically indentured servants. They couldn't afford their passage, so they would communicate with someone in America who was well-to-do, and they would pay for their right of passage. They'd come over and they had to work off their debt, so there was a contract, and that's how they came here. Really, servitude is a good definition of servitude is when you work for somebody else. Unless you're self-employed, you're somebody's servant. Now, not everybody owned property, so not everybody was growing crops. So I'm an indentured servant. Somebody pays me to do stuff for them, and there's an understanding. People were indentured servants. However, in this particular case, I think this whole section here, from verses 2 through 11, is mentioned here because that is often the way people would pay off their debts, especially if they were indebted due to a crime, like a penalty. If you were fined for your crime, then you could just pay it off. Everybody's happy. But if it was so much that you couldn't pay it, you would have to be sold for whatever amount of time to pay off that debt. And I think that's why it's listed here, because there's a judicial use for indentured servitude. In fact, over in the next chapter, the middle of verse 3, a thief must certainly make restitution. If he has nothing, he must be sold to pay for his theft. When we talk about indentured servitude, don't get this idea, don't envision plantations and shackles and chains and things like that. This may not even have been full-time. I can give you some examples from some other writings where someone had a debt and they worked for someone one day per week. That was their indentured servitude. So whatever the arrangement was. However, in this particular section, it's clear that whatever the debt is and however long it takes to pay it, it's got to be done by the 7th year. They call it the year of the Shemitah, the year of release, where debts are canceled. The crops, the fields are left fallow. There's no seed planted, and servants are freed. So it was a very nice arrangement. Even if you owed a lot of money and couldn't pay it off, you only could work so many years.
Do you know, what other nations' indentured servitude policy was compared to that kind of thing? Was Israel way ahead of the game in that way, or was it pretty similar?
I honestly don't know,
okay.
But I would suspect that there was probably a common practice at the time.
Okay.
Across the borders, but he's regulating it here as to what
mm-hmm.
especially that you only could work for 6 years at the most.
Yeah.
You notice, when did the idea of imprisonment become a consequence of?
Yeah, I don't know. That's not something we don't have in the Old
Right.
Testament. There's no concept of prison. You could be incarcerated to be held for a time, like until your trial, I suppose. But yeah, there's not a punishment. Restitution is the punishment.
Right. Interesting.
If somebody steals your stereo, do you want them to go to jail or do you want your stereo back?
Hand back double.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's exactly
All
what
in
would happen.
trouble.
So,
Biblical examples of prison happen in Egypt and in Rome.
Yeah.
And really, those are the who know is Israel or Hebrew connection.
okay, let's jump down to verse 12. This actually is a bit of a section unto itself grammatically. And everything here has to do with a personal injury that results in the death penalty. Now, those of us who studied the Noahide laws, we already know that murder is one of those crimes that result in the death penalty. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. So that's actually brought up here, but we also get a hint about something else that God has in mind. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. Nothing new. However, if he does not do it intentionally, but God lets it happen, he is to flee to a place that I will designate. But if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him from my altar and put him to death. We won't actually look these things up here, but in the notes, you'll see on verse 12, there's some references to Numbers chapter 35 and Deuteronomy 19. I'd recommend reading those. You may already know about the cities of refuge, but that's where it talks about that. Very interesting concept. Sometimes it's confused with prison, but you don't have to go there if you don't want to. It's a situation where I think a guilty party could do it too. Initially there were 6 cities of refuge, 3 on each side of the Jordan. And if you're in a situation like this, you could run there and seek refuge. And now remember, there's someone hired by the family to exact revenge, because there's this commandment about, whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. So they have the right to do that. However, God sets up a place where they can go, where that family member, the avenger of blood they call him, cannot touch him. Now, if he chooses not to go, or if he chooses to come out at some time, this avenger could actually kill him and not suffer any consequences for it, because it's seen as a judicial act. However, if he were to actually go into the city of refuge and kill this individual, he would be tried for murder. And the whole point here is that this person would stay there until their trial. They would have a trial, and if they were found guilty, they would be executed. If they were found innocent, which would be in this case second-degree murder, non-premeditated, then they would go back to the city of refuge and enjoy that security. And they would wait until the death of the high priest, and then they could leave. Now, again, the family member may, even after time, and even after the trial, they may not accept the verdict, could still go kill him, but he would then be considered a murderer himself. It's an interesting little loophole, and it shows that God is a God who looks at the heart. So in this particular situation, they had recourse. That business about take him from my altar, I got a couple of references there to 1 Kings, where someone would actually go to the temple and cling to the horns of the altar, seeking mercy. And in this particular case, if they're guilty, and they're to be taken from the altar and put to death. Now, these next ones here have to do with some capital crimes, which you would not normally think that they would be a capital crime, but because of to whom it is done, it becomes a capital crime. The verse 15 says, anyone who attacks his father or his mother must be put to death. Normally, a physical attack where there's injury would require eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? But there's a special situation when one assaults their parents. And in this particular case, God has decided that it's a capital offense. By the same token, if you go on to verse 17, anyone who curses his father or mother will be put to death. I don't think this is talking about arguments where people say things to each other that they regret. This has to do with loss, and it has to do with public shame, and there's a procedure here. It's not something that's done willy-nilly because, well, my son and my daughter mouthed off to me. It's not like that. This is a judicial thing, but the point is there's the respect for the parents here. This kind of goes right back to the commandment to honor your father and mother. Now, you might ask, well, what would one have to do to this? Well, this is a perfect example of something that's left up to the human judges. God has made his statement, but he's left it up to the human court to work out the details. And in your handout, we happen to have some rulings. Okay? This is, I'll give you a link for this later on, but this comes from Talmud. Remember I said, what was it last one? I think it was the week before, that Talmud actually comes in two parts. There's the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is what sometimes is called the oral Torah. And it really consists of these rulings of the rabbis, probably from before the time of Christ up until the first couple centuries. And it's like the law of precedence in our country, where a judge makes a ruling. Well, that's important. It may not be as strong as a law, but people recognize precedence in the rulings that other judges have made so that they keep the courts consistent with one another. So that's why the oral Torah was so important. And so on this particular issue, this is, there's a whole, the Torah is divided up into six, they call it 6 orders, or 6 groupings. And within each one of those are numerous tractates on various subjects. And then within each tractate, there's chapters. In each chapter, there's a verse, and each verse is considered a Mishnah. So that's what we're looking at here. So let's look over at the third page, page 46. It's number 3, should be highlighted. Now this one, I'm just going to read the highlighted portion here. This translation is nice, but they put in a lot of bracketed phrases just for clarity, but it's not really part of the Mishnah itself. So here it says, one who strikes his father and his mother without, however, making a bruise on them is liable, and it's skipping down to the highlighted part, is liable for all 5 items. Well, that makes a lot of sense, right? No, Jim, it doesn't. Okay. The 5 items we're going to discuss, that's on the first page. When you had a personal liability or liability for a personal injury, there were 5 things that had to be considered when it came to restitution. And we're going to look at those. But the point here is that, it's you got this law here that God gave, that if you strike your parents, it could be a capital crime. Well, someone has to decide how bad of a punch was it, how bad of a strike, and they are saying if the parents were not bruised. In that case, then what would normally apply for a physical injury would apply, like it would for anybody else. However, let's go to the next page where you see number 5 highlighted. It says, the one who strikes his father or mother making a bruise on them, and then there's another consideration, or he who injures another on the Sabbath, is exempt from the 5 items. In other words, those things don't apply, for he is charged with a capital offense. So really the whole point of this is that one would have to strike their parents to the point where they actually physically injure them. So somebody had to make the decision as to how to define it. Let's get back to chapter 21 and let's look at that verse in between those two. Anyone, this is verse 16, anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. This verse, in my opinion, is the reason that stealing is in the top 10. It's in the 10 Commandments. Remember I said with the 10 Commandments that I believe that those are there because in the worst case scenario, it's a death penalty. So how in the world would stealing cause someone to be executed? Well, it's a capital offense if you steal a human being, if you kidnap them. You've basically taken their life. Now here's a good reason to look up words when you do Bible studies because on the 10 Commandments in verse 15, where it says not to steal, the word for steal is ganav. And if you look here on verse 16, anyone who kidnaps, well, that's also the word ganav. The translator just decided to translate it steal in one place or kidnap in another place because of the context. But it's the same offense. So that basically confirms, I think, that that kind of stealing is why the commandment to not steal is in the 10 Commandments. It can be a capital offense if you steal a person. So now let's get into some of these rulings, and we'll talk about those 5 items that the rabbi set up. So let's look at verses 18 and 19. If men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held responsible if the other one gets up and walks around outside with his staff. Makes sense because these guys were fighting. If you don't want to get injured, don't fight. But nonetheless, if there is injury caused, someone has to be held accountable. But it says, however, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he is completely healed. So we have the beginning here of the 5 items. Specifically, he has to pay for the loss of his time while he's recuperating. And he has to take care of his medical expenses. He has to see that he is healed. So, the rabbis came up with 5 items. And, well, actually, the very first item has to do with the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle. So let's go back to our Mishnah copy here. This is going to take a little longer, but I think this is important. So, the 5 items are highlighted in yellow. And the first one is depreciation. I'll talk about that translation in a minute. Pain, the pain and suffering component. Healing, which would be his medical expenses. And loss of time, like we read in Exodus. And the last one is degradation. So let's look at these. I just noticed this when I was preparing for this. This word depreciation is sort of, whoever translated this, their word of preference. This particular tractate is called Baba Kama. You can see that at the top. And it's part of the Talmud order called Nizikin, which means damages. And I was noticing over here, remember, Nizikin is the plural of nezik. Now, if you look over here at the Hebrew portion, look at the second and the third line. And look and reading, starting on the right side, okay? Look at the second word in both of those lines. It's the same word, right? You all see it? Mm-hmm. Okay. That's the word that's translated depreciation over on the left. But in the name of the tractate, it's called damages. So really, I would prefer saying damage because this This first item of remediation here has to do with the primary concern, and that is the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The damage, compensating the person for the damage that was caused. Depreciation, I guess you could call it that. How are they less than what they were before? So let's look at this. One who injures a fellow man becomes liable to him for 5 items: for depreciation, pain, healing, for loss of time, and for degradation. How so regarding depreciation, or the damage itself? If he put out his eye, cut off his arm, broke his leg, the injured person is considered as though he were a slave being sold on the marketplace. And a valuation is made to how much he is worth previously before the injury and how much he is worth now. So you can see, now again, this, understand the word slave here. Again, this is the indentured servitude. How much would you pay to hire a man with 2 arms as opposed to one with 1? And if you can figure that out, especially over time, because this man may be, this is going to be for the rest of his life, you have to factor that in also. The difference between those 2 values would be consequently the price of an arm. Or, if it's something else, a foot or whatever, whatever it is that hinders him from being valuable in work. And my understanding, this is really no different than what's done today. If someone injures another person, there's a price for body parts, and that factors into the compensation they receive for their injury. So this is pretty much the same thing. So that has to be figured out. How much are they worth before, how much are they worth after, as far as hiring them? And now we get onto the pain and suffering. Some of the stuff becomes relative, but these guys had to figure this out because this came up in court. And what you're looking at here became something that was repeated. It became an oral tradition, so that it would be remembered and the courts would be consistent in their rulings. So with regarding to the second item, pain, if he burnt him with a red-hot spit or a nail, and even though only on his fingernail, which is a place where no bruise can be made, it has to be calculated how much a man of equal standing would pay to forego such pain. So the greater a person's sensitivity, the greater his suffering, the more he's willing to pay. So it's a bit relative there, but say you received this particular injury, how much would you be willing to be paid to let that happen to you? Now, to chop off a finger, I wouldn't do that for $5. But if you pay me $10,000, I might have to think about it. And so that becomes the compensation for the pain that the person endured.
The guy with high tolerance for pain would be at a disadvantage.
Yeah. Like I said, it's a bit relative. They must have set up a standard at some point so that it would be consistent in all cases. But someone had to think of this. And now the third item, healing. If he has struck him, he is under obligation to pay medical expenses. Should sores develop on his body, if as a result of the wound, the offender would be liable for that also. But if not as a result of the wound, for example, if it was his fault because he didn't follow the doctor's orders, he would be exempt for that part of the healing process. Now, if the wound healed, but it reopened, and healed again, but reopened, he would still be under obligation to heal him. If, however, it has been completely healed, he is no longer obligated to heal him. So those things have to be considered. Is the person following the doctor's orders? Well, then the person who caused the injury is not responsible for the victim's own negligence.
Who's keeping track of all that?
Somebody has to observe this,
Yeah.
I just wonder if it's the priest, actually, because remember, in Leviticus, they were the ones who examined people for skin infections and things like that, and they had to declare them clean or unclean. So I wouldn't be surprised if it were a Levite. Okay, loss of time. The injured person is considered as though he were a watchman of cucumber beds. They had to pick a particular occupation to be consistent. Maybe today we would use minimum wage. So, because even an injured man, lame or one-armed, could be employed in that capacity. Let's keep reading in the brackets there. As he is to be reimbursed for the loss of such wages that he could have made as a watchman had he not been ill. Okay, skip over to the next part after the brackets on the next page. There has already been paid to him the value of his hand or the value of the leg. So in other words, the loss of which prevents him from continuing in his previous employment. So he may not be able to work like he did before. So they're going to use this particular occupation as a standard for reimbursing for the loss of time. So even if, let's just say he is able to get back to his regular work, he's not working while he's healing. So that has to be compensated also. And then the last one is important because you can hurt someone even without physically abusing them. This is degradation. And I think we're just going to read the first point. All to be estimated in accordance with the status of the offender. Skip over that, go to the next sentence. One who insults, okay, this gets kind of funky here, but bear with me. One who insults a naked person, or one who insults a blind person, or one who insults a sleeping person is liable. Though if a sleeping person insulted others, he would be exempt. If one fell from a roof and did damage and also caused someone to be shamed, he would be liable for damage, but exempt from paying degradation. So really, the degradation really has to do with loss of esteem, and this is where defamation of character would fall in. So if you're in a situation where somebody says something bad about you, but it doesn't cause any loss, well then this wouldn't take effect. But if somebody says something bad about you, like you get a bad reputation on the internet, there are actually services provided for people who have lost their reputation because somebody wrote a bad review or something, and that can be cleaned up and also remedied. But there's a loss there that can be calculated. How much money did they lose because of this reputation issue? That has to be considered. That also happens today. Any questions on that? Okay, let's move on. Get into another special case. Chapter 21, verses 20 and 21. If a man beats his male or female slave or servant, this indentured servant, with a rod, and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. So, I believe the first verse 20 is there to make it clear, and God is making clear that you don't lose any of your human value because you're an indentured servant. If you kill a servant, you're going to be executed. It's just got nothing to do. It's the person's value because they're a human being is all that. That's what matters. However, you can discipline a servant. We'll see. There's some specifics on that too. But it says he's not to be punished if he's able to get up. In other words, there's not an actual injury or debilitating injury. But this phrase here, I just want to explain this one word. My I'm not sure, maybe yours says something different, since the slave is his property. Just so that we don't get tripped up on that, some people will look at that and say, oh, human beings seen as property. We can't read the Bible, Some people will do that, just like with the eye for an eye thing, or even the fact that we're talking about slavery or indentured servitude. In the Hebrew, it doesn't say property. It says his money. The slave is his money. And I think that's important to recognize, because here's the situation. This person has committed a crime, and they were not able to pay the debt, the fine that the court imposed upon him. And so someone else had to do it for him. Like this landowner, we'll say, came and paid off his debt. What do you do if this person isn't working? He has to be allowed to punish the individual to make him work because it's his money. He paid for this person's work. He didn't pay for the person. He paid for their work. And he has to be compensated for the fine that he has paid off. And that's the reason for it. But I would prefer that the person who translated this would have said his money, because that can cause some serious discussions. Let's skip down for a moment to verse 26. If a man hits a manservant or maidservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. If he knocks out a tooth of the manservant or maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. So this is what I meant about exceptions. Normally, you would have to pay damages for that injury that you caused. Remember the whole thing with the body parts and all that? The price on body parts? In this particular case, the servant goes free. Well, you might say, well, gee, that's not fair. But the thing is, remember, it's his money. So let's just imagine the loss that in fact, the loss might even be greater for the owner, depending on the situation. Let's just say this was a really heavy fine that this person owed. And he paid off this heavy fine. It was in the first year of the 7-year cycle. So he's got him for 6 years. Sure, it's going to be paid off. But let's just say that this guy's a creep, the owner. And, okay, he has a right to punish the servant because it's his money. But let's just say he goes too far and beats the tar out of him and injures him. And now he has to let him go because he broke a tooth or he broke a bone or something like that. He's out all of his money. He might actually be paying more than he would if he had paid the standard fee for a broken bone or a broken tooth. So it's a bit relative, but the whole point is the debt is clear. The individual can leave. The books are settled. So I think that's being factored in there. That the person, the idea is that if he does this and the slave or the servant leaves, it's his loss, the loss of the owner. Let's just go back up the part that we skipped. In verse 22, if men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. So we got some relativity there. I'm sorry to say I looked this up, at least from what I can find in the Mishnah, and it appears to me that the serious injury is referring only to the woman. I was expecting there to be something about the fetus. I think it's been a while since I looked at it, and I think there might have been something, but it was not what I was expecting. I was expecting the fetus to be, if there was injury there, that the fetus would be seen as a person, and the person who caused that injury would be penalized, just as if whatever damage they caused to the woman. So, just wanted to mention that there. I was looking for it, but I didn't find what I was looking for. So, again, here the point when it has to do with a human being causing a personal injury to another human being is a one-for-one correlation. Okay, and then we got all these special situations that God has provided, and then of course the experts, the judges had to somehow take this and apply it to whatever situation they were in and follow suit according to the precedents that God had set. Now, on item Roman numeral 2, letter A, number 3, where it says summary, we're not going to go through this, but if you want to follow up on this, I sort of supplied you with a scenario of the different offenses, and there's a little bit of flow of thought there, whether or not someone actually strikes somebody, or if they don't strike, or if the strikes are mutual. two people are hitting one another. A permitted strike, such as slave owners, someone owning an indentured servant, is permitted to inflict some punishment. An indirect strike or a permitted strike, and I got the verses there, and whether or not they're lethal. So there's a flow of logic there. So what we've seen so far has to do with direct personal injury. Somebody has done something to someone else. Now what we're going to look at is injury that is caused indirectly. Something that somebody owns causes pain to someone else, or damage, injury of some sort. So let's move on here to, verses 28. Actually, I think I'm going to read this whole section here, 28 to 32, and then we'll go back and look at the details. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the owner had been warned and has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull must be stoned, and the owner must be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned. There is a lot here. This is here primarily because it deals with human life and the responsibility of the owner of this animal. Let's see, where do we begin? I got some references here from certain rabbis. It's Rabbi Baya or a person named Rashi. These are rabbis from the Middle Ages who have made great commentaries on the Torah. And I thought they were worth noting. First of all, it says that the bull must be stoned to death. Now, according to this Rabbi Baya, this is not to punish the bull. The bull probably did not have ill intentions. You know, but really, the point here is to punish the owner. That's a major loss. Whatever he paid for the bull, what he might be using it for breeding, and the loss that will be incurred in the future because he doesn't have it anymore. It's really about the loss, causing loss to the owner. And the other thing is, it says that it must be stoned to death, and the meat must not be eaten. It seems rather odd to add that phrase, because if it's stoned, the animal didn't bleed to death, which would make it unclean. You're not supposed to eat an animal with its lifeblood still in it. However, I think the point here is that it's got to be stoned, thus making it unclean. But it also says the meat must not be eaten. The whole point here is that no one receives any benefit at all from the death of the animal. So say, for example, the owner knows that the bull is going to be stoned. So he decides the day before of the stoning, he's going to slaughter it. Oh, hey, that's fine, he's dead. Everybody's happy, right? And he proceeds to either eat or sell the meat for a profit. Well, then someone has reaped the benefit from this, and he's supposed to be losing. And so I think that's the reason why it says that the meat cannot be eaten. And that helps to ensure that the loss belongs to the owner. And he's not held responsible. Now we have this interesting scenario here in verse 29. If the bull has a habit of goring and the owner doesn't keep it penned up, now everything changes. The bull must be stoned and the owner must be put to death. This is, there's a legal term for this. Negligence is really the word here. He could have stopped the death of somebody. That's important. And it shows how really it comes right into play with loving one's neighbor. You are responsible for your neighbor's life in a situation like this. And knowing that you have an animal that, and who knows, like if this were today, it could be anything else, could be machinery. You know, you have a responsibility to look out for your neighbor. And if injuries have been caused in the past, the responsibility is greater if you don't do something to avoid it. And that's really what's going on here. Now, there is a little caveat. It says, verse 30, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. Now, back in, let's see here, Numbers, chapter 35, verse 31. Remember, Numbers 35 is where that whole topic of the cities of refuge is discussed. But there's a verse there, verse 31, that says you cannot redeem your way out of an execution. When it comes to actually murdering someone, you can't pay your way out of that. The person must be executed. So here we have a situation where a death penalty has been applied to someone who is negligent and he's to be put to death. But I think because it was not a premeditated offense on the owner's part, even though it was irresponsible, here in this situation, God clarifies he can't, if it's okay with the courts, somebody has to make a case for it. He could offer a redemption fee and not be executed.
This isn't super on topic, but have you, like, because you read this stuff a lot, reflected on Cain and that story at all, like in light of how serious God, like, you know, you die if you don't pen up your bowl, and then Cain killed his brother, and God was like, I'm going to give you this sign so that no one takes vengeance.
Cain knew what his punishment should be. He says, anybody who finds me is going to kill me. I can only speculate on
Right.
it. At that time, the amount of people that were in the world, to kill one person, how many people is that going to eliminate from potential human beings from the earth? Also, God had not established a law yet. And as you know, the earth got so violent and so corrupt that God had to destroy it. That was the reason for it. It just got to be so unruly. And so he sent the flood. Okay, Noah and his family survived. And the very first thing he does after they come off the ark, remember in the third month, they offer sacrifices and they receive some laws. And one of those laws is about murder. Yeah, I don't know what was involved with human government and what they could do or what was actually done prior to the flood. But we do know for sure that after the flood, God established human government and even allowed them the right to rule in a capital case, the death penalty. That was now in the hands of human government. So God did take care of it. But I don't know what happened, before that. It's hard to say.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
In verse 30, that you referenced about the payment is demanded, just for my own edification, maybe others, who gets to decide whether payment can be used to save the offender's life?
That would have to be the court, the judges.
So they would hear the case in this case and then decide, oh, you're not good enough, you don't get the payment fees in this time.
I think I don't know if there's something in Talmud about that. Well, I don't know if there's something in the Mishnah about that. I'm sure that the writers of the Gemara probably said a lot about it.
Yeah.
I don't know offhand. But things would have to be investigated.
Right.
Things have to be considered. The family of the deceased would have some say.
Yeah, but the rich guy that got killed, he doesn't need another 30 shekels,
Yeah, and then someone has to decide how much he would pay. And I would imagine it would have to hurt.
Right.
So that I would imagine that redemption price would vary.
Just look at our court system today, it's illogical in a lot of ways, but typically there's a penalty for an action. And it's not necessarily negotiable for the judge, other than the Supreme Court that most of the time. But it's interesting.
Yeah. One other thing in this section, it says that This law, in verse 31, this law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter, or a female or male slave. I think that was added, verse 31 under the be indirect. I got that from Rabbi Chizkuni and a gentleman named Rashi. They asked the question, why a son or a daughter? And their answer was, it doesn't matter of the age or anything, or their place in life. Slave, free, adult, child, a life is a life. And so the same penalty would apply regardless. Now, as often happens, we try to make nice, neat categories for these sections.
All right.
And for the most part, this is personal injury. We're deviating a little bit because now we've gotten to a section where it involves animals. Now, this made sense because this had to do with the loss of a human life, so it fits the personal injury. Now we're going to talk about something else that animals might do, which seems to be a little bit off topic. But that is starting in verse 33. If a man uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must pay for the loss. He must pay its owner, and the dead animal will be his. So there's almost like a one-for-one course exchange there. The owner who owned the animal that died gets compensated fully, and the person who dug the pit can do whatever he wants with the carcass. So they basically trade. You'll find this is often the case, whether it be with the law of personal injury or the principle of double, like we're going to read in the next chapter. And this is what I like about studying this stuff, is that it seems to me that God's sense of justice is to put the perpetrator in the position that they put the victim, and vice versa. So, like in personal injury, we got the one-for-one correlation. So one person is compensated, and the other person is out the price of the limb. And in the next chapter, if you steal something, there are some exceptions here, but the general principle is double. So, someone steals your stereo, they have your stereo. You can't just rule, okay, give it back. He hasn't lost anything. But if you, right now, the thief is one stereo more than what he had before, and the victim is one stereo less. So if you pay back double, he has to give back two stereos. So he's giving back the one that he took, plus one more. So now the perpetrator is one stereo less, and the victim is one stereo more. Just plain and simple, putting the perpetrator in the place that they caused the victim to be in. Very simple justice, neat and clean. And I think that's what's happening here. Verse 35, if a man's bull injures the bull of another and it dies, one other thing here. One of the rabbis from verse 33, about digging a pit and an animal falling into it, this Rabbi Chizkuni asked a question, well, why doesn't that apply to human beings? Someone had to ask, what if they fall into a pit? And his answer was, because human beings are rational people and they need to look out for themselves. It's that simple. An animal may not know to look out for a pit. I thought it was a good answer. If a man's bull, this is verse 35, if a man's bull injures the bull of another and it dies, they are to sell the live one and divide the money and the dead animal equally. So this is between animals. And so basically they both get the same benefit and the same loss. However, if it was known that the bull had a habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay animal for animal, and the dead animal will be his. So this that's pretty much it for that chapter. I do want to just mention one other thing. Let's go to the last page of the notes. you have a link there. Remember I said the Talmud was in two parts, Mishnah and Gemara. I like reading this link because this is just the Mishnah. Otherwise, it just gets to be overbearing if you look at the whole Talmud. So there you can go and just read the Mishnah, and if you go to that site, you'll see the 6 orders and the tractates underneath each order, and you can go in there and click on it, and you can see the various chapters. You click on a chapter, like for example, the ones we looked at tonight, you would go to a chapter called Nizikin. In fact, I have it written right there, Nizikin. And we're in the tractate called Bava Kama, and then you would go to these various ones that I've listed here, chapter and verse number. But I wanted to give you this list because I like seeing this correspondence between the things that we're reading here in Exodus and what some of these judges have said. And this stuff is old, and like I said, some of these individuals that are giving these Mishnah renderings were contemporaries of Jesus. Some came, this goes all the way up to the 2nd century. And then also from rulings from before Christ. So it's very interesting. Gives you some insight into the judicial system and how these individuals took what God gave them and they had to figure out the details. So,
I've got a scoop, sorry, Mike.
Sure.
I wanted to ask one quick question before I go. I'm just interested. Is there any mention in all your studies of this justice topic in the Jewish history through the Bible of people, justice being served generations later for people that, people blame generational problems on my problem? Is there any record of that being a form of justice? Where my great-great-grandfather did something that made you worse off today, therefore I will serve that justice today?
no.
No.
If you go back to, I don't have them here, but if you kept last week's handout, in the section in the 10 Commandments where I mentioned we were
They're
talking.
online on the website if you.
Okay, great. Where it talks about, this would be in verse 4 of chapter 20. Not verse 4, I'm sorry. Part of verse 5, where it says that he punishes the children for the sins of the father to the 3rd and 4th generation.
Mm-hmm.
In there you'll see, I got a note off to the side, I believe it's to Ezekiel, chapter 18. That's the one where it starts off saying, you've heard the proverb that the parents have eaten sour grapes and so the children's teeth are on edge.
Mm-hmm.
It's a proverb saying that, something that one generation does has an effect on the other. And even though we have what God says here, and I think this needs to be interpreted, in that chapter he talks about how, say you have a righteous man and he follows God's law and he's going to reap the benefits. And if his son turns against God, he's not going to reap the benefits because of his father's goodness or his father's righteousness. He will pay the penalty for his own sins. And consequently, if you have a bad man, and he is held accountable for that, but he has a son who chooses to walk in God's ways, it will not cross generations. And it really shows how God is looking at the individual. Mm-hmm. And that information in Ezekiel 18 needs to be considered when looking at this passage in the 10 Commandments about generational issues.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
that is a good question. So I like pairing these things up here with these references from the Mishnah and the verses in Exodus with which they correspond. So if you have spare moments, you need something to do, trouble sleeping, take some of these on. And some of these we've already done. Like at the very end, we got chapter 8, verse 1 and verses 3 and 5. That's what we looked at tonight. And they corresponded with those verses in Exodus. And so we have some things here regarding the atonement payment, which I think would be, it's that it's the redemption fee for when your bull has killed someone, and it was.
Thank you.
It wasn't. The situation where the animal had a habit of goring people. the liabilities of those, what if it's not your bull, but you rented it? What liability falls upon you for something like that? And then there is that little information I was talking about, the valuation of an embryo. If a pregnant woman is injured, that's there. I just want to mention one thing. You see in italics here, the words tam and muad in some of those lines here. You'll see that word actually, it's not translated when you read the Mishnah from this particular website. But all that it means is the word tam means innocent. So that means an animal that has never done it before, has never caused an injury to a person, whereas muad is a kind of derivation of the word witness. In other words, they've been seen having done this before. So that's really what we're talking about here. Was the animal in the habit of goring? If it was, it's muad. If it's never gored anybody before, it's tam. It's innocent. So keep that in mind. But these are interesting because someone had to answer the question. Well, how do you define has a habit? An animal has a habit of goring. How many times do they have to kill someone or gore someone before it's considered a habit? What time span has to take place? Like, for example, someone might say, well, they have to have gored someone 3 times. Okay, now is that within a year's period? Over a decade? It's interesting that somebody had to work out these details because these guys just didn't sit around thinking about how to make up new rules. These were probably cases that were brought before them, and they had to make a decision. And then their ruling became part of the Mishnah, so that others could follow suit based on their precedents. I find it to be very interesting. So, yeah, if you get a chance, look at that website. If you have any problems, let me know. I'll be happy to answer them, or answer your questions. Any other questions? Good. And next week will be our last week on this subject, and we'll talk about property damage and theft.